Thanks for joining this webinar. My name is Thomas Ihajas. This is going to be a webinar covering one of our newer releases of Docker Desktop, which we've called Hardened Desktop. The title of this webinar is Securing Docker Workspaces, or Developer Workspaces at Scale, rather. We're going to be walking through some of the security advances we've made over the past few months, introducing you to that new Hardened Desktop feature, and talking about how you can actually go about procuring that through the business subscription. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide here. This is just a little intro to me. My name is Thomas. Again, I'm one of the sales engineers here. And I'll get right into the introduction. Why security? Why is security important? Why is a feature like Hardened Desktop important? Well, increasingly, we're seeing test and development environments that a lot of our Docker users are using that are under attack, not just production environments anymore. Cyber attackers are finding new ways to breach companies every day. And the number of security breaches and the cost to mitigate these breaches is escalating year over year. In 2021 alone, right, 80% of cybersecurity breaches were due to human error, and the other 20% involved attacks on desktops and laptops. And whether this is accidental due to things like bugs or misconfigurations, or on purpose, such as attempting to relax or bypass organization security settings, these do all increase the risk for breach. We've also seen this in the real world with recent supply chain attacks with malicious NPM packages, for example, in which attackers create malicious packages that resemble legitimate ones, which developers then download and run in their workstations. These packages then install malware in the host machine to exfiltrate sensitive data. Such breaches have increased awareness that security is needed at every step of the development lifecycle, which starts at the developer's environment, such as their laptops and their virtual desktops. So that's kind of a little bit of background as to some of the security threats that have arisen in the past few years, and we actually were able to identify what we believe are 5 main security threats that are most commonly affecting these test and development environments. And throughout this session, we're going to talk about how Hardened Desktop seeks to address each of these threats. But for this side, we're just going to talk about what exactly are these threats. Because even though running software inside containers is generally considered to be more secure than running software natively on the host, nonetheless, these tools, these container development tools, need to be properly secured to reduce the risk of security breaches in your developers' environments. So just running through the list here, starting with malware attacks. These most commonly occur when developers inadvertently download a malicious container image in their local machine and then run it. Or when, let's say, a developer exposes the container engine API on their network without protection. Supply chain attacks, just the next one there. These generally occur when developers, for example, inadvertently pull a malicious package into a container, or developers might use a compromised or vulnerable container image as a layer in other images that they create. That third one there, vulnerabilities might also arise from developers having admin rights to their local machine. This could result in things like relaxed firewall rules, turning off of anti-malware software, disabling of updates, potentially installing of untrusted software, and then misconfigurations there. These happen because, most container development tools give developers that full control over the configurations and settings of the tool. But an incorrect configuration, something like disabling the network proxy, disabling software updates, might result in developers opening the door for attacks on their workstation and potentially compromising the entire organization. Finally, development tools are a prime target for malicious insider threats because they can be leveraged to perform malicious activities disguised as legitimate ones, given what these tools can do. So that's just a little background into the 5 threats that we identified. Now we're going to talk about the secure software supply chain. This is something that we've leveraged in recent years. And we're going to kind of go over first what it is, and then how it seeks to address these 5 threats. So what is the secure software supply chain? Basically, all modern software is built using multiple dependencies and open source components. These dependencies contain both known and unknown vulnerabilities, which means it can be incredibly important to know what dependencies and components developers are using in order to understand exposure and mitigate those risks. Open source dependencies typically involve multiple developers, multiple teams, multiple systems created by contributors both inside and outside the organization. Attackers and malicious actors aggressively target these dependencies in open source components to exploit vulnerabilities and gain access to an organization potentially. This is why a secure software supply chain needs to include secure dependencies, secure code, secure containers, and secure infrastructure. So that's a little bit of background as to what the secure software supply chain is. Now we're going to talk a little bit about historically what we've done to address these security threats and kind of build our own secure software supply chain. And the way that we did this historically was through our trusted content. So our trusted content is really these verified images that live on Docker Hub, our public image marketplace. And we've kind of separated this trusted content into three different types, just running through these here. The first being official images or Docker official images. This is a curated set of images that sort of exemplify Dockerfile best practices and ensure that security updates are applied in a timely manner. So verified to be, secure, up to date, frequently maintained. DVP images or verified publisher images are images created by our partners. These are sourced from trusted repositories, authenticated by Docker, very commonly, frequently maintained by these partners. And then the last one there is sponsored open source images. These are images that are from projects sponsored by Docker and maintained by non-commercial open source developers. So that's just a little taste of what we've done historically to help organizations like yours improve their security posture. But now we're going to get into hardened desktop. So hardened desktop is what we're doing now. This is, again, one of our later releases of Docker Desktop. It's basically the name that we gave to the 4.13 release and the features that live within it. I'm going to talk about the four main sort of features within the overall release of hardened desktop. And I'll go over each of these individually and talk about what are the threats that they seek to address, how do they actually address them, and how are they configured? So how would you be able to go about configuring each of these settings? So the first one is settings management, just kind of running down this list. This just allows you to distribute a file with pre-configured and locked settings to your developer's machine, so they're not able to edit any of the settings that are mentioned in that file in their own Docker Desktop instances. One of those settings is actually the second bullet point in this list, which is enhanced container isolation. This basically allows you to lock down the Docker Desktop application by creating some isolation between the containers that your developers are using and their underlying VM. And again, I'll talk about all of these in a little bit more detail on the following slides. The third bullet point there, registry access management. This is actually a feature that's been out for a few months now. Basically allows you to allow or restrict access to specific registries that your developers can pull from or push to. The reason why it's sort of bundled up into this hardened desktop release is because the way that you would go about configuring each of these is actually pretty similar. We do, for maximum security posture, we do recommend that you enable all of these. And that last item there, image access management, this just allows you to restrict access to specific categories of images in Docker Hub. So if you do plan to use Docker Hub as a registry, this will come in handy in sort of limiting what developers have access to pull from. So that's kind of an overview into the main tenets of hardened desktop. But now I'm going to get into what each of these actually involves. So the first one, settings management. I talked about this a little bit. Basically, the way that it's configured is through what we call the admin settings.json file. I'll show sort of a screenshot and an example of what this looks like on the next slide. But for right now, basically, it's just a JSON file that you would distribute via some sort of mobile device management solution that you might be using, SCCM, Jamf, for some examples of these types of solutions that we've seen customers have success doing. And once this file is installed on your developers' machines and they're authenticated, they won't be able to change any of the settings that are mentioned in that file. They'll all be pre-configured with the settings that you provide for them. So it's a great way to just sort of lock down what developers might be doing. On the next slide here, I have an example of what this file might look like. So this is taken right from our documentation. But basically, it is essentially a list of settings that have these pre-configured values here. So you can see we have Kubernetes settings, we have enhanced container isolation, which I'll talk about next. Again, as I mentioned before, things like proxy settings and automatic updates that might be important to lock down, those are handled here as well. Disabling the automatic sending out of autonomized usage data could be important just for privacy purposes. So this is basically just a full list of what you have the ability to lock down through this file, this admin settings.json file. And if you visit our documentation, we do have official documentation dedicated to Hardened Desktop, as well as a page dedicated to each of these individual features within Hardened Desktop. You'll get a look at the full list of parameters that and values for each of these settings that you can configure in this file. So that's settings management. Segueing into the second one, we talked about one of those settings being enhanced container isolation. This is a setting that basically, it's a new setting. So it was never before seen in Docker Desktop, but it basically provides an additional layer of security that uses a variety of advanced techniques to harden container isolation without impacting developer productivity. So basically what this means, sorry, I just got to move my little zoom bar over here. So some of these techniques are mentioned on the slide. For example, running all containers unprivileged through the Linux user namespace, restricting containers from modifying Docker Desktop VM settings, preventing console access to the Docker Desktop VM. So all of these techniques in tandem kind of harden that container isolation and prevent containers from bypassing Docker Desktop registry configurations. They prevent containers from accessing sensitive data or secrets stored in the VM, or accessing the Docker engine, which is the name that we've given to our sort of underlying command line functionality in the Docker ecosystem, preventing containers from peeking into other containers or attacking the host machine. So very important feature. If you do decide to implement this admin settings .json file, we do also strongly recommend that you add on this enhanced container isolation setting as well. So the next setting here, just going down the list, registry access management. So again, this is a feature that's been out for a few months now, but we're sort of bundling it into this Hardened Desktop release. And basically what it is it allows you to allow or restrict access to registries. So we've seen a lot of customers, using Docker Hub as a registry where they actually push images to repositories that live in Hub. But we also have quite a few customers that are using a third-party registry or an internal registry instead. Some examples here on the slide: JFrog Artifactory is one, Amazon ECR is another, Azure Container Registry is one. These are very popular examples of registries that customers are using. And a lot of these customers actually don't want their developers even to access Docker Hub as a registry. They don't want developers to be able to push to Hub. They don't want them to be able to pull from any repositories in Hub, even public images, verified images. So what they might want to do is they might want to configure this setting to allow access to their own registry, but prohibit access to all other registries, including Hub. And the way to do that is actually not through a JSON file, but it's through Docker Hub itself. So this is just a screenshot of what that page looks like. It's located within your organization settings in Docker Hub. So if you have a business organization under a business subscription, you, as an owner or as an organization administrator, have the ability to go into your org settings, just on that settings tab, and then down to the tab that says registry access, and this is where that setting lives. You'll see there's a little note there that says if you turn on this feature, it automatically blocks access to any registry that isn't mentioned in the list that you create. So again, really great use case if you're using a third-party registry. Even if you're using Docker Hub, though, it's still a great feature because it does automatically block that access. So if you wanted to just allow access to Hub, you could keep that little toggle turned on for Hub, and it automatically blocks access to everything else. But if you wanted to do the opposite, you could just click that little add button there on the right, add the address to your registry or multiple registries if you have multiple. And then if you wanted to just restrict access to Hub. Either way, whichever registries that you're using, as long as they do have an address to point to, you would be able to add them to that list. So again, just a really great way to kind of limit the risk of things like malware and supply chain attacks by preventing the possibility of developers pulling images from untrusted sources. And the last setting we're going to talk about is image access management. So this is similar to registry access management in that you're restricting access to what developers can do in Docker Desktop. But instead of kind of acting on the registry level, it's acting on the Docker Hub specifically level. So you're looking at specific images within Docker Hub that you want to allow or restrict access to. So the way we do this is we sort of divide all images on Hub into one of 4 categories. And I'll actually show that on the next slide here. Again, just kind of a screenshot showing where this is. There'll be this screenshot is a little bit outdated, and it'll show, instead of saying org permissions, it'll say image access, but it's basically in the same place that you would find those registry access settings in your business organization. But we take all the images and we divide them into one of 4 categories. I've gone over official images and TPP images, but just to reiterate, those are verified to be secure, up to date, very frequently maintained, not very commonly considered to be malicious or unsecure in any way. That top category there, organization images, those are images that already live inside your organization. Those are usually assumed to be safe in some way, because a developer would have gone in and pulled the image from a source and then pushed it to a repo in the org. And then that last category there, community images, that's really just any other public image that lives in our marketplace. So those could be the images that would potentially be unsecure in some way, malicious, not verified, maybe not frequently maintained, maybe out of date. And those might most likely, I would say, be the types of images that you would want to restrict access to. So what we've seen a lot of customers have success doing, just like with registry access, turning on image access as well, if they're using Docker Hub as a registry, because again, these settings only pertain to images on Docker Hub. If you're using a different registry, you would need to configure the settings within that registry. But within Docker Hub, we've seen a lot of customers leave on access to maybe organization images and those official and TPP images, but restrict access to basically everything else. So all of those community images that could potentially be malicious. And I should mention as well, now kind of bringing us back to looking again at a high level at hardened desktop, these features do sort of require that developers are actually authenticating to the desktop application. We do strongly recommend that in addition to something like the admin settings.json file, rolling out another JSON file that we call our registry.json file. So this is not nearly as complex as the admin settings.json file. This is just a 1-line file that contains the name of your Docker Hub organization. And if the file is installed on your developers' machines in the correct directory, they won't be able to, they basically won't be able to use Docker Desktop unless they're signed in to an account in that organization. So if they want to use Docker Desktop unauthenticated completely, or maybe they want to sign into a personal account that isn't attached to their company email address, if they have this file installed, they'll just get an error message that says you must sign into an account in your org in order to use Docker Desktop. So that's sort of our mechanism for enforcing that authentication. Because without that authentication, right, if they're not in the org, then the settings that you apply to the org won't apply to them. So having that registered JSON is sort of a crucial step in actually making sure that all of these features, all of these settings are being properly utilized and developers are actually following the rules that you set forth for them. But that's basically a high-level look at hardened desktop. Again, we touched on the 4 main tenets of it. We looked at settings management, just pre-configuring, locking down those settings. One of those settings being enhanced container isolation. So just providing some isolation between the containers and the underlying VM. Registry access management, again, just allowing or restricting access to different registries. And then image access management, just allowing or restricting access to specific categories of images within Docker Hub. So now that we've talked about hardened desktop, we can talk a little bit about how you would actually go about procuring something like hardened desktop. So hardened desktop, as I mentioned, is a release that is specific to Docker Business. And I'll touch a little bit on what Docker Business is. So basically, what we did with Docker Business is we took Docker Desktop, one of the most loved, most wanted developer tools, and we bundled it into an enterprise-grade subscription, perfect for organizations of any size that want to allow their users to, continue using Docker Desktop, but with that additional security and administration that come from features like hardened desktop. On the secure software supply chain, just kind of going down the columns here, we're basically using our existing hub infrastructure to offer you the most secure, the most up-to-date, the most frequently maintained images for your developers to use via our trusted content, which I talked about. And then management at scale, right? With the administration, you get faster developer onboarding, which really comes in handy, especially for larger organizations who have, hundreds or even thousands of developers. And this all makes for a more productive experience overall, both during the onboarding stage and after, by leveraging the performance of Docker Desktop, the application, but constantly making improvements thanks to the capabilities of our product and engineering teams, but also thanks to the feedback that we receive from our customers. So that's a little taste as to what the business subscription is. We did roll it out about a year ago, and in that year or so since it's been rolled out, we've really invested a lot in the subscription by adding features like Hardened Desktop. And Hardened Desktop is just one example of a feature that we've added to make the entire desktop or Docker Desktop experience more fulfilling for both developers, the end users of the product, as well as administrators, those who actually care about enforcing those security rules and care about the ease of administration and the visibility into what developers are doing. So just to kind of cherry pick a few features from this list here, over on the left side there, Docker Desktop for Linux, we have a very large Linux user base. And historically, before this year, they were really only able to use Docker Engine on Linux, which, as I mentioned, is basically the command line functionality. But now we've rolled out Docker Desktop for Linux, so that gives them the full suite of the Docker experience. So it gives them that application. They have that enhanced functionality through the application, as well as that GUI, that interface that kind of gives them a more friendly user experience. We also have our Docker SBOM feature. This is another security feature that we rolled out a few months ago. Gives you the ability to run the Docker SBOM command from your command line to generate what's called a software bill of materials for the images that you're using in Docker Desktop. So, you can see basically within an image, what are all my dependencies and what version are they all on? So you can kind of get a sense of how secure things are, and maybe take remediations if a dependency is out of date. And then finally, just touching on one last feature here, SSO and SCIM. This was something that was really highly requested before it was rolled out. Basically, a lot of you may be familiar with single sign-on, just providing you a more secure authentication that you're likely already using for some of your other applications. It also provides, in addition to that security, an ease of use, a reduced overhead for administrators, sort of removing the need for admins to manually or individually add each of their users to the organization. SSO kind of automates that process. And with the SCIM piece, it further automates it by directly syncing with your identity provider, whether that be Okta, Azure Active Directory, any identity provider that you might be using. For instance, if a developer joins the company, they're automatically added to your organization. And when they leave, they're automatically removed and a license is freed up for someone else to take. So you don't have to worry about who's constantly coming and going. SSO and SCIM take care of that for you. So again, just some examples of the investments that we've made in the Docker Business subscription since rolling it out. And just a couple more slides here. This is just sort of a logo slide. We see a very wide range of industries and businesses using Docker. Just to kind of touch on a few here, I see some healthcare, education organizations. We have pure tech, looks like gaming, retail companies, automotive. So just a wide range of industries that are covered here that have seen the value of Docker Business and found some success from it. And finally, this last slide is just sort of a call to action. If you're interested in what you've heard me talk about so far regarding Hardened Desktop, how it helps to improve your software supply chain, the Docker Business subscription as a whole, and the features that we've added, I really encourage you to check out our website. This QR code, hopefully it works. It should take you to our official page to contact a sales representative. If you are able to scan that with your phones or something, to go to that page. If not, I think there should be a link. I believe it's just, I think if you just look up Docker contact sales, you might be able to find this page anyway. But we figured just putting the QR might make it a little bit easier. But anyway, that's sort of how you go about acquiring that business subscription. But in the meantime, though, we do have our official documentation out on all the features I talked about today, all the different facets of Docker or of Hardened Desktop, just so you can take a look. We also do have a Hardened Desktop white paper that's coming out within the next few weeks. that'll be sent to all of you who registered for the webinar, just so you can get a high-level look at the feature, pass it around to your colleagues. Maybe it includes some details that I might have missed in this presentation. But with that, that concludes the presentation portion of the webinar. I wanted to leave, I know we only have a few minutes, but I wanted to leave some time for Q&A. It looks like we have a few questions in the chat. We'll go ahead and use the remaining 3 minutes to answer as many of these as I possibly can. But looking at the first one here, does the distribution work for all Docker users regardless of OS and version, basically? The hardened desktop model will not work for Engine on Linux. So again, if you're using Docker Desktop on Linux, which I mentioned, it will work for that. It'll work for Docker Desktop on Windows. It'll work for Docker Desktop on Mac, but it won't work for Docker Engine on Linux. It needs that application behind it, basically. And as I mentioned, I might have glossed over this a little bit, but 4.13 is the newest, or I should say the oldest version of Docker Desktop that actually supports hardened desktop. I believe we're on 4.15 now. So if you're using one of the latest versions, 4.13 or later, then this feature should be supported. All right, and I see a question about trialing Docker Business features. So basically, they're asking if you're able to obtain a trial for Docker Business. Right now, our stance is no, we don't offer free trials for Docker Business. If you do want access to something like registry access management or be able to enable SSO or try out hardened desktop, you would have to purchase a Docker Business subscription for that. What we do recommend, and we have seen customers do this, is starting with a small number of seats, even as small as something like 5 to 10, which you're able to purchase online via credit card. And then if that works for you, you can go ahead and add more seats as you see fit. I see one last question here. I'm going to try to answer it in the minute that I have left. Can we configure in-app messaging to inform developers to upgrade to a newer version that's compatible with hardened desktop? And the answer to that, unfortunately, is no. We don't offer any sort of customized in-app messaging. We've seen customers communicate this internally and have success doing that. But we're not able to allow you to configure that to happen in a customized way. So it looks like there's a few more questions, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to all of them, but it looks like we are about at time here. I want to thank everybody for attending. I hope that this was informative. And again, let me go back to the previous slide, just in case you weren't able to scan this in time. This QR code does take you to our page to inquire about the business subscriptions. But that's basically the last call to action. Again, that white paper is coming out with more information on hard desktop, but I hope you learned something. And thanks for dropping by and have a great rest of your day.